My son called me twice that Saturday night. I missed both calls. By the time I called him back, he was sitting in his truck in a parking lot 3 miles from his in-laws' house, holding a bag of frozen peas to the side of his head, and he still tried to tell me it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the last time I ever let it be nothing. Welcome to Dad's Pure Revenge. If you're watching this from somewhere new, drop your city in the comments. I like knowing where this story's landing tonight. And if stories about fathers who finally stop swallowing it hit close to home for you, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's more coming. My son's name is Caleb. He's 29. Before I tell you what happened to him, I want you to understand who he is, because it matters. Caleb was the kind of kid who fixed things without being asked. When he was 14, he noticed our neighbor, an old widower named Mr. Doss, couldn't get his trash cans to the curb anymore, so Caleb did it every Tuesday night for 3 years and never once mentioned it to me. I found out from Mr. Doss at his funeral. Caleb stood in the back of that service in a borrowed tie and didn't say a word about it. Not then, not ever. When Caleb got married 4 years ago, he married into a family that had money and made sure everyone around them knew it. His wife's name is Brooke. Her father is Gerald Ashford, and Gerald owns Ashford Motors, a used and certified pre-owned dealership that's been sitting on the same 11 acres off Amnicola Highway in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for going on 22 years. Gerald hired Caleb right out of the gate, made him a sales manager, told everyone at the wedding reception he was bringing family into the business. What Gerald didn't say out loud, but showed constantly, was that he considered Caleb an employee first, and a son-in-law a distant second. I'm 59 years old. I run a commercial real estate company here in Chattanooga, Delaney Properties. Been in my family since my father started it in 1971. We own land. We lease it out. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and it taught me patience I didn't always know what to do with. My flaw, if I'm honest with you, is that for years I let Caleb handle his father-in-law on his own, because I didn't want to be the interfering dad. I told myself I was respecting his marriage. Really, I think I just didn't want the confrontation. I'd watch Gerald talk down to my son at Thanksgiving, and I'd bite the inside of my cheek and pass the potatoes. Saturday, September the 13th. Family dinner at the Ashford house, one of those brick colonials up on Signal Mountain, with a view that costs more than the house itself. I wasn't there. Brooke's mother, Renee, only ever invited me to the big holidays, but I got the full account later, first from Caleb, then from someone else who was standing closer than anyone realized. Dinner was at 7. By 7:40, Gerald had already made 2 comments about a deal Caleb had lost that week. A trade-in on a Silverado that fell through because the customer's financing didn't clear. Caleb tried to explain it wasn't his fault. Gerald cut him off, said something about how a real salesman finds a way, and Caleb, mildly, not raising his voice, said maybe Gerald should have handled the numbers himself if he thought it was so simple. That's when Gerald Ashford stood up from his own dinner table and struck my son across the side of the head, open-handed, hard enough to knock his fork off his plate. Nobody at that table got up. Nobody gasped. And then Brooke, my son's wife, the woman he married in front of 200 people, looked at her husband holding the side of his face and said, "Maybe that'll remind you to watch your tone." Caleb told me later the room went quiet in a way that wasn't shock. It was agreement, like everyone at that table had been waiting a long time for someone to finally put him in his place, and they were relieved it had finally happened. He got up, said nothing, and walked out to his truck. I want to tell you about somebody else who was in that house that night, because she matters to this story more than she knew at the time. Her name is Monica Reyes. She's the finance manager over at Ashford Motors. Been there 11 years. And she'd come to the dinner because Gerald liked to parade his staff around at these things like trophies. Monica wasn't family. She didn't have to say anything, but she followed Caleb out to the driveway, and she didn't offer him sympathy. She just said, "Come find me at the shop Monday, before he gets in. I want to show you something." That was Monica. She never made a show of decency. She just did it, quietly, over and over, the same way she always closed out the books at Ashford Motors, down to the penny, even when Gerald told her not to bother. When Caleb called me that night, he tried to make it small. "It's fine, Dad. It's a family thing." I heard the peas crackling against his skull through the phone, and I said, "Caleb, a man does not put his hands on my son and get to call it a family thing." He didn't argue with me. I think some part of him had been waiting 4 years for someone to say that out loud. Here's the part I didn't tell Caleb that night, because I didn't want to give him false hope before I knew what I was going to do with it. Ashford Motors doesn't own the 11 acres it sits on. Delaney Properties does. My father leased that land to Gerald's father back in 1998, and when Gerald took over the dealership, he took over the lease too, at a rate that hadn't moved much in 20 years, because my father liked Gerald's father and never had the heart to renegotiate. That lease was up for renewal on December 1st, 10 weeks away. I hadn't thought much about that lease in years. I'd let my property manager, a woman named Denise Ford who's worked for me since 2009, handle the renewal paperwork on autopilot every 5 years. I never looked closely at what else was sitting on that land, or who else might want it, because it never occurred to me that I'd need to. For a few days after the dinner, I didn't do anything. I told myself I was thinking it through. Really, I was doing what I'd always done, turning it over quietly, waiting to see if it would resolve on its own, the way I had every other slight from Gerald Ashford for 4 straight years. I drove past the dealership on a Tuesday, on my way to another property, and sat at the red light out front longer than the light required, just looking at the lot, at Caleb's old Silverado parked crooked by the service bay, and I still didn't call anyone. What changed my mind wasn't rage. It was Wednesday morning, September 17th, when Brooke called Caleb to ask if he was coming to dinner that Sunday like nothing had happened. Not an apology. Not a question about the bruise that had gone yellow-green along his jaw. Just, "Are you coming Sunday?" That was the moment something in me stopped waiting to see how this would resolve itself and started deciding how it would. I called my lawyer, a man named Alan Whitfield who'd handled Delaney Properties contracts for 20 years, and I asked him one question. What happens on December 1st if we simply don't renew? Alan told me it was clean. No penalty, no obligation, nothing owed either direction. The lease would lapse, and Ashford Motors would have 90 days to vacate the land it had operated on for over 2 decades. I want to be clear about something. I never once considered violence. I never considered showing up at that house. What I considered was this. Gerald Ashford built his entire operation on land that was never his, and he had spent that entire time treating the people under him, including my son, like they existed to absorb whatever he felt like putting on them that day. I decided he could keep, just not on my family's ground. I called Monica Reyes directly, not through Caleb. I looked up the dealership's main line and asked for her by name. I told her who I was and asked her one question. If Ashford Motors lost its lot, would she want to run a dealership herself, on the same land, under new ownership? She was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Mr. Delaney, I've been doing that man's job for 6 years while he took the credit. Yes. That was the whole plan. Not complicated. I wasn't going to ruin Gerald Ashford. I was simply going to stop being the reason he had anywhere to stand." Through October, the letters went out the way letters do. Formal, dated, certified mail, exactly 90 days notice as required. I didn't call Gerald. I let Alan's office handle every piece of correspondence, clean and procedural, nothing personal in a single line of it. Meanwhile, Denise and I quietly began drawing up a new lease. This one with Monica Reyes and 2 investors she brought in, for a dealership that would open on that same 11 acres under a different name by spring, with Caleb offered a genuine partnership stake instead of a desk his father-in-law could slap him across whenever a trade-in fell through. Gerald didn't figure it out right away. The notice went to his corporate mailbox and sat for 11 days before someone in his office flagged it. When he finally understood what it meant, the calls started. 4 on a Tuesday, then 9 more by Thursday. By the following Monday, I had 31 missed calls from a number I didn't have saved, and I knew exactly whose it was. He had no idea, calling and calling like that I already knew precisely how this would end. I just hadn't decided yet whether I owed him the conversation. I gave him the conversation. I'm not a man who hides from what he's done. We met at my office on a Thursday morning, November 6th, 9 o'clock sharp, because I told his assistant that was the only time I had. He came in wearing the kind of suit that's meant to remind you who's supposed to be in charge of the room. He sat down across my desk and said, "You're really going to do this over a family argument?" I said, "You hit my son at his own in-laws' dinner table, and your wife told him he had it coming. That's not a family argument, Gerald. That's the reason." He tried 3 different angles in that meeting. First, that I owed him loyalty as family, then that Caleb exaggerated what happened, then, when neither of those landed, that I'd regret losing a tenant who'd never missed a rent payment in 2 decades. My voice didn't rise through any of it. It didn't need to. I told him the paperwork was final, that Monica and her partners would be taking over the lot in the spring, and that Caleb would be joining them as a partner, not an employee. I watched something in his face go still when I said Monica's name, like he was only then understanding who exactly had been running his business for him. He stood up to leave and said at the door, "She's my daughter. Brooke's not going to forgive you for this." I told him that wasn't really his to forgive on her behalf, and it wasn't really mine to worry about. That part I meant. Ashford Motors closed its doors on the Amnicola Highway lot at the end of February. Gerald tried to relocate to a smaller site across town, one without the traffic or the visibility he'd had for 20 years, and from what I hear, it's struggling. I didn't do anything to make that happen beyond what I've already told you. I just stopped propping up a man who never once thought to ask himself why the ground under his feet had always been so steady. Caleb and Monica opened the new dealership in April. I went to the ribbon cutting. Caleb shook my hand at the door instead of hugging me, which told me everything about how much that day meant to him. Some things a man holds together by staying formal, because if he lets himself feel it all the way through, he won't get through the ceremony. Brooke didn't come to any of it. She and Caleb separated in March. I won't pretend that part doesn't sit heavy with me some nights. I didn't do this to break up my son's marriage. I did it because I couldn't watch him spend the rest of his life apologizing for existing in a room his father-in-law controlled. But I know that if Brooke had stood up from that table on September 13th, instead of telling him to watch his tone, none of the rest of this would have needed to happen at all. I think about that more than I think about Gerald. I don't need Gerald Ashford to apologize to me. I don't think he has it in him, and I stopped waiting on people to become something they've shown you, over and over, they're not going to become. What I've got instead is a Saturday morning routine now. Coffee with Caleb at the new shop before it opens. Watching him walk that lot like it's finally his to walk. That's enough. It's more than enough, actually. It's the first time in 4 years I've watched my son stand somewhere and not brace for what might come next. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It helps this channel more than you'd think. And if you've ever had to decide between